Welcome. We'll just wait a couple of minutes to let everyone filter in to today's webinar. Thank you for joining us for National Science Week. This is the first event for Women in Nuclear Australia for National Science Week. So we're happy to have you join us today. All right, we might get started now. So welcome. Before I start, I'd like to say that Women in Nuclear Australia acknowledges the traditional custodians of the country throughout Australia and their connections to the land, sea and community. We pay our respects to their elders, past, present, and extend that respect to all Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples today. Welcome everyone to today's webinar, which is Becoming the Incredible Hulk and Debunking Other Myths About Radiation. Women in Nuclear Australia Incorporated, or WIN Australia, is extremely excited to be sharing this webinar with you today. In case you're not familiar with WIN Australia, we're a not-for-profit association of women and individuals of other genders who work professionally in various fields of nuclear technology and radiological applications in Australia. One of the aims of WIN Australia is to promote understanding and public awareness of the benefits of peaceful uses of nuclear and radiological applications, especially amongst women and young people. WIN is an international organisation with members from over 100 countries. Today's webinar is being supported by Inspiring Australia as part of National Science Week. WIN Australia would also like to thank our sponsor, the Australian Nuclear Science and Technology Organisation, or ANSTO, for its ongoing support of WIN Australia and its objectives. We would also like to acknowledge the ongoing support of the Australian Institute of Nuclear Science and Engineering, or ANSTE. Now let's dive into today's RAD webinar. This is the first in a series of 4 webinars for National Science Week. My name is Jazz Diab, and I am the Vice President of WIN Australia. I am a nuclear scientist turned engineer. I'm also a fan of superheroes. I've got my little Smile and Joe fission here. So I'm super excited about today's webinar, which will demystify radiation and its effects on us. We will start with a presentation by our superhero scientist, Dr. Gillian Hirth, and then be followed by a question and answer panel session where Gillian will be joined by Andrew Popp and Tina Paneras to answer your burning questions. To ask a question, please utilise the Q&A function at the bottom of your screen. And please remember to be kind and respectful to our guest, as this is a webinar for all ages. We'd also like to let everyone know that this webinar is being recorded and will be distributed to those who are unable to attend today, and it may be used for WIN promotional purposes. No one in the audience is visible to us today. You can see us, but we can't see you. So no need to be concerned about being recorded, picking your nose or fixing up your pants or something. All right, so Dr. Gillian Hirth is the Chief Radiation Health Scientist and Radiation Health Services branch of the Australian Radiation Protection and Nuclear Safety Agency, or as we call it, ARPANSA. She's also the Deputy Chief Executive Officer of ARPANSA and the current chair for the United Nations Scientific Committee on the Effects of Atomic Radiation, or UNSCEAR. Dr. Hirth has a PhD in environmental radiochemistry, and today is going to tell us why more of us aren't in possession of superhero powers thanks to radiation exposure. Dr. Hirth is a member of WIN, and we're lucky to have her present to us today. So welcome, Gillian. The webinar is all yours.
Okay, so can you see my screen? Yep, thumbs up. Thank you. So thanks, Jazz, for that really kind introduction. And it's a real pleasure for me to be here to support WIN Australia as part of National Science Week. and I hope that I can provide a science-based explanation about radiation and radioactivity and debunk some of those myths that exist about radiation and whether or not you too could become the Incredible Hulk. So let's get started. This is the gamma radiation exposure scene in the 2003 Incredible Hulk movie. There's a lab technician working furiously to get a circuit fixed on a gamma emission system. The system shorts, the control computer's not working properly. Bruce Banner comes to the rescue in the gamma exposure lab. The gamma emission sources have charge building up almost to 100%. The sources are now locked and armed. Bruce Banner sort of throws himself in front of the gamma emission sources while the lab technician hides behind him. The emissions proceed, green light flashes, his eyes turn a funny green colour, and boom, it's like there's been an atomic explosion. Bruce Banner was exposed to a high dose of gamma radiation that should have killed him, and it led to him becoming the Incredible Hulk. So if that was your first time you'd heard about gamma radiation, what would you think? Would you be afraid? There are a number of heroes or villains in the Marvel universe that obtained their powers following exposure to radiation, one way or another. In addition to the Hulk, and amongst others, there was Spider-Man, who got his superpowers overnight after being bitten by a radioactive spider that caused a break in his DNA. These stories are entertaining and have some very loose connections to fact, but with correlations to events such as nuclear explosions or accidents, it's no wonder that radiation can be so misunderstood and ultimately feared. But what do people learn from these movies? At ARPANSA, we monitor what information the public accesses on the web pages, like our fact sheets. And in April and May 2019, we noticed that there'd been a spike in people accessing our gamma radiation fact sheet. But what was the driver? Any ideas? Yep, a Marvel movie. Avengers Endgame was released around this time, and Bruce Banner had managed to merge his intelligence with the Hulk's physical body using gamma radiation. We noticed something similar had occurred in April 2018 after the Avengers Infinity War movie was released. This movie also referred to gamma radiation. I guess one positive out of this is that people wanted to find out more about gamma radiation and landed on the ARPANSA website and had the opportunity to read our fact sheet and hopefully correct some of the things they just watched. But if people took the movie as fact, would you fear radiation and what it might do? And fear of what you don't understand is not necessarily a good thing. And it's also why we do need to correct certain myths around radiation. So before I start, I thought it's important to mention my sources of information. Throughout my presentation today, I'll talk about references and reports that have been produced by the United Nations Scientific Committee on the Effects of Atomic Radiation, or UNSCEAR, a scientific committee of experts, of which I currently have the honour of being the chair. UNSCEAR was established in 1955, initially to study the effects of atomic radiation on people as a consequence of the atmospheric nuclear weapons testing and the radiation that remained following the horrific events at the end of the Second World War in 1945, the nuclear bombs that were dropped on Hiroshima and Nagasaki in Japan some 75 years ago last week. I'll also refer to and use illustrations from the booklet written by UNSCEAR and published by the United Nations Environment Programme. It's available free for download on the UNSCEAR website and in a number of languages. It provides an easy-to-read overview of radiation sources and effects and is based on almost 65 years of review and study of scientific publications. I should state that UNSCEAR only studies atomic or ionising radiation. You can also access information in the form of fact sheets via the ARPANSA website that I showed earlier, which in most cases is also developed on the scientific reports of UNSCEAR. So what is radiation? Radiation can be described as energy or particles from a source that travels through space or other mediums. Across the spectrum of radiation, there's non-ionising radiation and ionising radiation. Non-ionising radiation covers the radio spectrum, microwaves, infrared and visible light sources, and ultraviolet radiation. Non-ionising radiation doesn't have enough energy to make changes to atoms or molecules. It does not mean it's not hazardous if you're exposed to very high levels, but it doesn't make changes at that atomic or molecular level. Ionising radiation, on the other hand, can eject electrons out of atoms, thereby ionising them, making changes at the atomic or molecular level. In my presentation today, I'll discuss ionising radiation, what are the sources, where can it be found, and what can be some of the effects. So there are three primary types of ionising radiation, and they have different penetrating powers. Alpha particles and beta particles are not types of energy that are part of the electromagnetic radiation spectrum, like gamma rays and X-rays. They are energetic particles emitted from the atoms of radionuclides. So when you have unstable atoms, known as radionuclides, they can emit alpha particles or beta particles. Radionuclides therefore emit radiation, and the rate of this emission is called the radioactivity, or more simply, the activity. Alpha particles are the least penetrating. So if they are outside your body, then they pose little risk. However, if you ingest them or breathe them in, they become an internal hazard. Beta particles are more penetrating than alpha particles, so that if they are outside your body, they can pose an external hazard to the surface of your skin and eyes. And if you ingest them, they also pose an internal hazard. Sometimes the emission of these particles can also result in a burst of energy in the form of the gamma ray. Gamma rays and X-rays, which are pure energy and a type of electromagnetic radiation, can penetrate through the body and pose both an external hazard and an internal hazard. Each ionisation releases ionising radiation that deposits energy into cells or tissues surrounding the atom. This energy can interact with other atoms and ionise them, and can also cause harm in cells, such as DNA breaks. Naturally occurring radionuclides and the radiation they produce has existed on Earth since long before life emerged. This natural radioactivity is sometimes referred to as our natural background radiation. So let's take uranium-238, a natural radionuclide present everywhere in the Earth's surface. Uranium-238 is an atom which is naturally unstable, and it sits at the start of the uranium-238 decay series. Uranium-238 emits alpha particles to decay to produce thorium-234, which is also an unstable atom. Thorium-234 emits beta particles and also a gamma ray emission as it decays to protactinium-234. And so it goes through the uranium-238 decay series until we reach stable lead. Of note, as we proceed through this decay series, are radium-226, radon-222, and polonium-210, and I'll mention these later in my presentation. So I've now seen how gamma rays can be produced through radioactive decay. Gamma rays can also be produced as cosmic radiation that originates deep in outer space and from events such as solar flares. And we also have X-rays. These are generally produced artificially using things like X-ray tubes, when an electron beam emitted by a cathode is fired at a target material called an anode. The X-ray spectrum depends on the anode material and the energy of the electron beam. X-rays are frequently used in medical equipment for diagnostic imaging. So if you break your arm, you go and get an X-ray. This type of medical exposure to radiation is a large source of radiation exposure in the world today. In relation to radiation units, the most important to know are the following. So I've already spoken about the activity, which is the measure of the radioactivity of a radionuclide. and it represents the numbers of decays per second and is expressed as becquerels. There's absorbed dose, which is the amount of energy deposited by the radiation in a unit mass of material, such as a tissue like the skin or an organ like the thyroid. It is expressed as grays, which corresponds to joules of energy per kilogram. We have effective dose, which is the absorbed dose multiplied by radiation weighting factors that take into account the type of radiation, alpha, beta, or gamma, and organ factors that take into account the susceptibility to harm of different tissues or organs. The effective dose is expressed as sieverts. Effective dose is routinely used to discuss whole body dose, taking into account all types of radiation, the pathway of exposure, and all the organs and tissues that are exposed. I'll mostly talk about effective dose to the whole body in this presentation. So where in the world does radiation come from? It's very important to understand that everyone, everywhere, is exposed to some level of ionising radiation. And this is known as the background radiation exposure. UNSCEAR has calculated the global average effective dose to the public. This includes exposure to natural background sources and exposure to some artificial sources, such as diagnostic medical procedures like X-rays. This does not include exposure to radiation that's delivered as part of medical treatments for cancer, or exposure that might occur as part of your work. The global average effective dose in UNSCEAR's last public report on this topic was estimated to be 2.4 millisieverts. But around the world, it can range from 1 and up to 10 or more millisieverts per year. And in a few unusual circumstances, it could approach 100 millisieverts, although these circumstances people do tend to avoid. Your level of exposure depends on what you're exposed to, so whether it's an alpha, beta, gamma, or X-ray radiation. It depends on how you're exposed. Internal exposure, such as ingestion of radionuclides in food or inhalation of radionuclides in air, or external exposure from the radionuclides present in the environment. And it also depends on the level of activity you're exposed to and how long you were exposed. So why can it vary so much? So it depends on where you live and what you do. For example, I currently live in Melbourne at sea level, and I receive about 0.3 millisieverts per year of dose from cosmic radiation. If I went to live in Tibet at 3.7 kilometres above sea level, I would get 1.8 millisieverts per year. This is 1.5 millisieverts additional radiation background exposure just from choosing where I live. If, for example, in the future, something like space tourism became a reality, you could get approximately 0.8 millisieverts per day you spend in space. Other factors that can influence background radiation, again, is about where you live. Around the world, there are high natural background radiation regions. These normally have high levels of uranium, naturally occurring uranium or thorium, which may increase your external exposure, so gamma radiation from thorium, or internal exposure, particularly from the inhalation of the gas radon-222 that I mentioned before, that's part of the uranium-238 decay series. So if you lived in these high background areas, you can have significantly higher background radiation dose. Although the maximum boundary of the ranges that are given on this slide would tend to be upper estimates and worst case scenarios. So the real estimates, may be closer to the lower bounds of this, but again, it can still demonstrate how background radiation exposure can change that contribution depending on where you live. Other factors, again, where you live around the world is with medical exposure. And this can vary significantly and is strongly correlated to the level of healthcare and whether you live in a developed or developing country. So again, the UNSCEAR report in 2008 was when the last evaluation of medical exposures was completed, and UNSCEAR is currently updating this and hopes to publish a report next year. So tier 1 healthcare levels in the 2008 report, the average annual contribution to the dose pie chart was about 1.9 millisieverts per year if you lived in a tier 1 healthcare level country. For Australia, that was about 1.7 millisieverts per year. For developing countries that may have less access to things like CT scans and X-rays, their estimated exposure from medical radiation was at 0.3 millisieverts or even less. Finally, there are things like accidents, like the Chernobyl nuclear power plant accident in 1986 and the Fukushima accident following the Great East Japan earthquake and tsunami in 2011. We've also seen nuclear weapons testing, and all of these things have the potential to release artificial radionuclides such as iodine-131, cesium-137, strontium-90, and plutonium isotopes into the atmosphere and surrounding environment. These additional radionuclides can also increase exposures to people who might be impacted by these events in the immediate areas or over longer distances. The release of these artificial radionuclides can also cause variations, sometimes large and sometimes small, in the level of background radiation exposure in the longer term. Again, it depends what was released, what activity was released, how long does it remain in the environment, and how you were exposed. Impacts and exposures related to these accidents are complex and could be discussed in a whole presentation on its own. Accidents can also cause many other impacts that are not radiation related, but are caused by stress and the disruption to life that may occur due to evacuation and relocation of citizens. And in many instances, the fear of radiation and what the exposure might do is a major concern of stress, is a major factor in stress. This is why it's important to understand that radiation is always present, what the exposures can or cannot do, and whether or not it does have the potential to cause effect over a lifetime. Finally, when discussing radiation, I should also mention that people are exposed to radiation through the conduct of their work. These exposures are not included in the pie chart, but are managed as additional doses under radiation protection regulations. Regulations that organisations like ARPANSA administer. People who work with radiation are able to receive up to 20 millisieverts of dose per year, although very few people do. This dose is in addition to the background radiation dose. Again, there can also be significant variation depending on how you're exposed and what you're exposed to. So as you can see in this slide, if you worked in the nuclear industry, so in a nuclear power plant, your annual occupational exposure could be around 1 millisievert. Yet you could work in a coal mine and get 2.5 millisieverts, and that could be predominantly from radon exposure. Or you could be aircrew, and most of your radiation exposure would come from cosmic radiation. So there are a lot of factors that can influence and affect occupational exposures. So next, radiation dose and effects. So in this graph, the y-axis is the probability of a health effect, and the x-axis is the increasing dose. The grey shaded areas represent, along each of these axes, the areas where there is a high uncertainty in either the estimate of risk or in the estimate of dose. So when we look at radiation, it's broken down into 4 key ranges. We have very low dose. So this is generally around 10 milligrays or 10 millisieverts. And these correspond to the range of exposure that any member of the public may experience under normal circumstances on a yearly basis. At this level, the risk is uncertain, and there may also be high uncertainty in the dose estimation. So risk of health effects, whilst it may be biologically plausible, there is no scientific evidence to support health effects at this level. In the low dose range, which is from 10 millisieverts or 10 milligrays up to about 100 milligrays, 100 millisieverts, these levels are levels that may be incurred by a few individuals as a result of their occupational exposure, sometimes following an accident, or it can actually be as a result of multiple diagnostic examinations using things like CT scans. Again, in this range, it may be biologically plausible, but there is limited scientific evidence to support health effects. Although as we approach the 100 millisieverts, this scientific evidence does become slightly stronger. So at this level, even though we might understand the level of dose better, there is still significant uncertainty about the level of risk. For moderate doses, which is above 100 millisieverts and up to about 1 sievert or 1 gray, is where we'll see transient responses that may be detected if the dose is incurred under relatively short time periods, and where at the higher end, acute effects of short-term exposures are to be expected. The rate at which effects are observed is proportional to the dose delivered. Finally, with high doses, so doses above 1 sievert, we see acute effects of short-term exposures, and the exposures and effects above this level are quite well understood. So when I talk about early effects or late effects, what do I mean? The early effects are also called tissue reactions or acute effects. They generally occur when there's been high dose of ionising radiation delivered over a short period of time, and the severity of the effect is proportional to the dose. At several hundred millisieverts delivered within a short time frame, you may see transient tissue reaction in reddening, but not necessarily acute illness. People may also have an increased risk of delayed effects like cancer over their lifetime. From about 500 millisieverts up to 1 to 2 sievert, we may see cataracts on eyes, epithelial damage, so damage to your gut linings, anemia and immunodeficiency, some requiring intensive medical care. People may recover, but may have longer-term recurring effects and an increased risk of delayed effects, such as cancer. These levels are typically seen with medical treatments for cancer, where high doses of ionising radiation are being used in a targeted and controlled manner in order to kill cancer cells. Acute effects and illness from these treatments are expected, but people recover and the cancer, in many cases, can be killed. High doses like this were also seen during the Chernobyl accident. Then we have delayed effects or stochastic effects. Delayed effects can be observed with doses in the moderate dose range, so in the 100 millisievert to 1 sievert, and high doses up to a few sieverts. Cancer and heritable effects that can develop years or decades after the exposure. There is some evidence of delayed health effects below 100 millisieverts in certain circumstances and exposure situations, but there are many difficulties in statistically discerning effects below 100 millisieverts. Other health effects, such as cardiovascular or heart disease, connective tissue degradation and cataract of the lens of the eye have also been associated with radiation, although there is uncertainty whether these sit fully in the stochastic or in the early effects. An example of a situation where delayed health effects were observed was following the Chernobyl accident, where children in the 0 to 14 years age category who were exposed to moderate and high doses of iodine-131 in the early phase of the accident went on to develop thyroid cancer. The peak of the development of thyroid cancer occurred between 5 and 9 years after the accident. And adults who were exposed to the same levels of iodine didn't see this was not observed in adult populations. So this is where other factors such as age and sex at the time of exposure can play and have an impact in whether effects can be seen. Children can be more radiosensitive in certain circumstances, such as iodine exposure to the thyroid. Finally, we also have environmental effects. These have probably been studied more recently and and looking at effects on wildlife at the population level. The effects that can be observed can be increased morbidity and mortality of populations, reduced reproductive success, and other subtle effects that may impact ecosystem function. Finally, around low and very low doses. These are doses that are routinely encountered by members of the public and most present-day radiation workers, and there is little or no epidemiological evidence of health effects. Environmental radiation exposures, such as the high background radiation areas that I mentioned earlier, that can have low dose rates, but because they're experienced all the time, can result in low and moderate doses. The potential excess cancer rates in these areas are expected to be small and potentially not detectable. These regions were studied in its 2017 report, but it's also why it's important to understand that where we live, we are all continuously exposed to radiation in our natural environment, and that there can be significant variation around the world. This understanding can help alleviate fears that any radiation exposure must be bad and must be dangerous, when it's not necessarily true. So overall, there are many benefits from radiation and its applications in our world. Many of these will be discussed in the following WIN presentations this week. CT scans for diagnostic imaging, linear accelerators for cancer therapy, and reactors and facilities for radiological production. So when we're talking about superheroes, who are the real radiation superheroes? Well, is it Wilhelm Röntgen who discovered that X-rays could be used to look into the human body? Or was it Henry Becquerel who discovered that a mineral containing uranium was radioactive? But I think in acknowledgement of women in nuclear, Marie Curie is the real superhero. Marie, who with her husband Pierre furthered Becquerel's discovery and identified that uranium decayed to produce radium and polonium. The Curies shared their Nobel Prize with Henry Becquerel in 1903. Marie worked out how to extract and collect radium, and in 1911 she won a second Nobel Prize, this time in chemistry for her discovery of radium and polonium. Radium became commonly used as a treatment for cancer and was shipped around the world, including to Australia. And a copy of the Curie certificate that came with that first 0.98 milligrams of radium is on display at ARPANSA from when we imported that radium into Australia from Curie's lab in 1927. Marie also built on Röntgen's discovery of X-rays, and during World War I, she assisted the development of mobile X-ray trucks that became known as Petite Curies. She trained women as technicians in X-ray use and to support the troops who were injured while fighting in war so they could be treated and triaged in the field. She worked to support the development of X-ray departments at hospitals, not only during war, but also during peace. And she was acknowledged by many great scientists for how she helped humanity by the work she did. The discoveries of radioactive substances and her efforts to establish X-ray departments at hospitals have led to many advances in medicine, and many of these are still relevant today. Marie's daughter, Irene, continued her work, and together with her husband, Frederick, both received the Nobel Prize. However, it is important to say that both Marie and her daughter, Irene, died from anemia or leukemia, believed to be associated with their exposures to radiation, and in particular to radium-226. So in summary, can you become a superhero? Radiation is all around us at very low levels and low doses, and there is little or no epidemiological evidence of health effects. Radiation can have many effects, and these can be significant. It can cause breakages in DNA if delivered at high doses, and effects may be delayed and often observed years or decades later. But the Incredible Hulk would never have survived a gamma dose of radiation, such as the one he experienced. He would have died from acute radiation effects. And a bite from a radioactive spider would not have had this effect on Peter Parker, and Spider-Man would certainly not have been created overnight. So in my view, if you really want to become a superhero, become a scientist and be like Marie Curie. Thank you. And yeah, happy for questions.
Thank you, Gillian. That was awesome. I'm always intrigued by ionising radiation. So hopefully the audience out there now has a bit of an understanding about how the effective dose and exposure affects us and how we're exposed to it every day and why there aren't more Incredible Hulks wandering around the planet. So we've got a few questions coming in on the Q&A function. I'll remind everyone, type your question in and we'll get to it. I would now like to welcome two more members of WIN to our panel. So we have Andrew Popp and Tina Paneras. Andrew is the Manager of Radiation Protection Services at ANSTO and is an ANSTO incident controller in the event of an emergency. Andrew is a physicist and holds a Master of Science in Radiation and Environmental Protection. Tina is a radiation safety training educator at ANSTO. Tina started off as a geologist and is a health physicist and has been training radiation safety for over 12 years. So Gillian, Andrew, Tina, let's start by going through some questions. So I have a question here from an anonymous attendee who asks, are pilots and flight attendants considered radiation workers?
Yeah, I can answer that. Yes, they are considered radiation workers. How they are managed, because this is a technical question about exposure situations. Because they're flying in the air, you can't put easy controls over the level of cosmic radiation they're exposed to. So aircrew can have doses sort of in the 4 millisieverts up to, depending on what routes you fly. So if you fly from London to New York, you actually get more exposure because you're at a higher altitude, but also a higher latitude than if you're flying, say, Melbourne to Sydney. But yes, they are. Yes, they have models that actually estimate aircrew exposure. There's set rules and regulations that they can follow. So for if a female flight attendant becomes pregnant, then that's something that they can discuss with their employers to minimise radiation exposure if they're pregnant. So yes, they are counted as radiation workers, but people that travel for the purpose of employment are not considered radiation workers. So, you know, some of the frequent flyers may actually get quite significant doses, but again, that would be one of those variables that would fall into the background radiation dose calculation.
Thank you. So the next question was emailed in, and it was about exposure on accident sites. So what kind of exposure do emergency responders receive when they're attending a radiation accident? So I might hand that over, Andrew or Tina.
I can start that one. Hopefully an emergency worker will get a very controlled exposure from that instant response, and they shouldn't get anything that's unreasonable. However, the rules are different for emergency exposure situations because it acknowledges that things are going wrong and the priorities are to save life and protect property and the environment. So as a result, emergency workers are allowed to get up considerably more than you can for a planned exposure situation. So to save someone's life, it's been pre-justified an emergency worker could volunteer and get up to 500 millisieverts of effective dose. So the planned exposure situation, the legal limit is 20 on average any given year. So you can go considerably above that. And that's okay, because nothing bad is really going to happen to them. They might feel a little tired after that kind of exposure. But what they are taking on board is a statistical increase in their chance of getting a cancer later in life. But what you're weighing up against then is the chance of saving someone's life right there and then versus the possibility that they might get a cancer later in life, which is a risk as an emergency worker they take all the time, especially give an example of firefighters. They run into burning buildings. There is a high probability they could get hurt doing that. So it's all part for the course for emergency workers.
Thanks for that, Andrew. We're getting a lot of questions about looking at computer screens, having your mobile phone next to you, questions about 5G. So I guess we can try and answer them all at once. What sort of radiation are we getting from computer screens, phone screens, the 5G network?
Well, I guess I can take that one and just say none of it is ionizing radiation. So Gillian spoke about ionizing radiation and non-ionizing radiation. Ionizing radiation is the one that we're talking about in terms of health effects that it can cause, that the idea that it could turn you into the Incredible Hulk, those sorts of things, which we know isn't true now. But in terms of computer and phone screens and 5G, that's all non-ionizing. It doesn't mean that it's not harmful, it just interacts with your body in different ways. And I don't know if anyone else wants to pick it up on the non-ionizing side of things, or we could direct you to some useful information on the ARPANSA website for those ones as well.
So I've just posted the link in the answered questions to the ARPANSA 5G non-ionizing radiation information booklet. So feel free to jump on there and it should have a lot of really good information about non-ionizing radiation. Okay, so we've had a lot of questions from Susan, who's very keen about getting more information out there about exposure to radiation. So Susan has asked, wondered why Marie Curie and her daughter were dying from probable stochastic effects. Did they not care about radiation protection? So I guess it's how much did we know back in the early 1900s about radiation protection and what research is ongoing about human exposure to radiation?
So I think one of the important things to note is that a lot of radiation research, so Willem Röntgen, who discovered X-rays, also probably died from a type of cancer that was from his research, along with the Curies and many medical professionals in the early days of using things like radium for medical treatments and researchers who were working with radiation. It was, I guess, observed that a number of them did become unwell and die from effects. So this is really a lot of the medical doctors and researchers that were originally involved in that research were the ones that started studying the effects of radiation and actually implemented what we consider, the first radiation protection frameworks. Back in the 1928, I think. So the International Commission on Radiological Protection, which is one of the organisations that provides recommendations for radiation protection in occupational settings, They were established, in 1928, and that was really about initially medical uses of radiation. So yes, it was observed, and yes, it led to the study of the impacts of radiation on humans, and that, of course, has been evolving since that time.
Thanks. So the next question we have from Belinda is, are all cancers caused by radiation? If so, if there was no radiation, would cancer not exist? It's a bit of a big one.
In short, so no, not all cancers are caused by radiation. There are a number of different mechanisms, both from an ionizing radiation point of view, but also from a chemical reaction point of view in the body that cause breakages in DNA, which then could result in it being repaired incorrectly and then going on to become a cancer. And so the source of that, the breaking down of those molecules and the breaking of the sugar bonds for the DNA, isn't just ionizing radiation that does that. There are other mechanisms too.
So a follow on from that, Gemma asks, if someone does get a dose of radiation at some point, then later gets cancer, how is it, or is it possible to know whether the radiation has caused cancer or whether other lifestyle choices have played a part, or is it genetic?
Okay. I'm happy to have a go at that one. This is probably one of the things that, when we talk about why at low doses, it can be quite challenging to determine what the causes of the radiation are, because there's no specific genetic indicators that can say, this type of cancer was actually caused by, a radiation exposure. And I think also because there are so many things that we are potentially exposed to, so alcohol, cigarettes, caffeine, many things and chemicals that we are routinely exposed to at, low levels like radiation, that it's actually very, hard to determine exactly what causes any cancer. However, what we do see globally is that there are what's called the background or the general incidence of cancer. And that's sort of a baseline rate that in every population you'll see a certain number of cancers. And this is where in the Chernobyl accident, when 5 to 9 years after the accident, you could see thyroid cancers developing in children. So thyroid cancer has, it's called a latency period of, a minimum of about 5 years that you wouldn't start to see a thyroid cancer from exposure to iodine-131 start to appear in a population until about 5 years. And that runs until about 13 years. You'll see, and if you look at the Chernobyl results, you'll see that there is a peak. And the number of cancers that they saw then were the ones that were above that baseline incident rate. So there was always a baseline incident rate, and then there's the cancers that you can see above that rate. But you will never be able to tell out of the baseline ones, which would have happened whether there'd been an accident or not, or the ones that were specifically caused by the accident. You can't tell the difference between those two. So it's, I hope that answers the question.
Yeah, thanks. So the next one's from Bernie. Now I'm going to skip to the last part of Bernie's question because I find it very interesting. And it says, is it true that TVs using the cathode ray tube type had more radiation release compared to LED screen types?
I can take this if you want.
Sure.
So the cathode ray tube, inside it is firing electrons at the phosphorus screen to make the image, but all of those low energy electrons are contained inside the TV, so they don't actually get out. The LED is a different kind of technology that uses just the electronics and light emitting diodes to create the image on the screen. So technically, yes, the LED TVs have less radiation associated with them, but the cathode rays are safe in themselves, because all of the radiation that's inside is contained inside the TV. And if it's broken and you open it up, then there's no electrons, because they need the power to be created.
I should unmute myself. Thanks for that, Andrew. The next question we have from Belinda is, what happens if you ingest alpha particles?
I can take that one if you like. So basically, alpha particles are quite a large particulate form of ionizing radiation. They don't tend to travel very far in air. So if you had a radioactive source that was giving off alpha particles, if you were trying to measure those alpha particles and you were measuring at more than, say, 5 centimeters from that source, then you wouldn't be picking up many of those particles, because the alpha particles just basically run into particles in the air around us and lose their energy very quickly. So that's why when alpha particles are outside your body, they tend to be less hazardous, or not hazardous, because when they come across your skin, they don't get further than the dead layer of skin cells on your skin. However, when you get them inside your body, that's when they can cause damage, because they can release all that energy that they have in very localized area. So let's say you ingested something into your gastro system, then there is a chance that that radiation source giving off the alphas could get lodged somewhere in your system, and then it can do a lot of localized damage wherever it ends up, because it loses that energy in such a small area. Same deal if you were to inhale it and you get some alpha emitting particles inside your lungs, then it can do a lot of damage there as well. So that's why alpha radiation tends to be quite hazardous getting it inside your body, because it loses a lot of that energy in a very localized area. Whereas if you compared that to, say, something that gave off gamma radiation, if you were to ingest something giving off gamma radiation, a lot of that gamma will actually pass through your body and out of your body without interacting with so many different cells within your body at the same time. So in terms of which one is the most hazardous, alpha is the most hazardous to get inside your body.
Awesome. Thank you, Tina. You also answered the question about if gamma rays hit you, do you die? So that goes straight through you. We have a question from Pamela here, who says, I've worked in the mining industry and would like to know if major exposure events can occur there from natural radioactivity.
Who's answering?
Yeah, from a planned exposure point of view, not really, because typically dose rates in the mining industry are quite low. The challenge for controlling doses there is that even though they're quite low dose rates, because you're working in that environment pretty much all year long, it tots up over time. But the major events, there's not really anything that can really generate a lot of radiation all at once, such that you would get a large acute exposure. Where you could have issues is if like there's environmental spills and things like that, but then it's more of an environmental management issue rather than radiation exposure point of view.
Awesome.
I could probably add to that one as well and say, you know, it depends on the type of mine. Underground mines, so they're in closed spaces, will have higher radiation than an open cut mine, for example, that you might see with some coal mining or uranium mining. But often the ventilation systems that are in underground mines, because you have to keep either, you know, air replenished so people can breathe, or you're removing other hazardous gases such as carbon monoxide, which can build up, but also explosive gases like methane. So there's, you know, control factors for air exchange. Some of the mines where you can see really high doses is actually in really deep mines. And I know in, I think, South Africa, there are some mines where the miners are operating at about 5 kilometres below the surface, and it gets really hot. So they actually have to air condition, and so they get a lower air exchange. So their radon doses can actually be higher. So again, it always depends. Every exposure situation is going to be different, and it really depends on what you're exposed to and what controls are in place.
So a nice follow-on question to that from Rachel is, how do we go about limiting the damage to healthy tissue when someone receives either a radiation treatment for cancer, or they're even exposed so naturally, if they're working in a mine, they're going to be naturally exposed? And is that even possible?
Actually, could I ask you to read that question again?
Yeah, sorry, I tried to merge a couple of questions together. How do we go about limiting the damage to healthy tissues when somebody receives a radiation dose?
Okay, so with radiotherapy, what the technologies that are used with radiation therapy are really to target the cells. So you'll see with linear accelerators, they're a very targeted beam. The amount of preparation that needs to go in with MRIs or CT scans to identify exactly the dimensions of the tumour, where it is, to minimise that radiation exposure to healthy tissue is really important. The other thing with targeted radiation is that sometimes the radiation that's delivered to a tumour is really quite high. So you can get 2 grays of dose targeted at a tumour. So that's not whole body dose, but really targeted dose. And so you can have those sorts of high doses delivered over, say, a weekly period of time. So over a course of radiation therapy, someone might have received 20 grays, but 20 grays delivered at that specific target. 20 grays to your whole body is not what you want to see. So this is where absorbed dose compared to effective dose is understanding. But, people do get sick from radiotherapy, but they get sick in order to get better.
Great. Well, we've only got a couple of minutes left, so I'm going to ask one final question, which is from Sam, who asks, are there any shows or movies or other media that portray radiation science really well? So I might get each of the panelists to give us, I guess, if they think anything does portray radiation or nuclear science well.
I can think of one that definitely doesn't. And that is, if anyone's a Star Trek fan out there, I always find it amazing that they're flying into a high radiation field and they start counting down the seconds until they're all going to die. And then suddenly they escape that field and they're all fine with no ill effects whatsoever. So if you're going to try to find, helpful information about radiation exposure, don't look to Star Trek for that sort of education. But I'll keep thinking about one that does.
Don't go to superhero movies either, would be my other suggestion. Yeah, I'd have to take that one on notice and come up with some good examples of, I'm sure there are some documentaries.
There must be. I watched the first episode of Chernobyl when it came out, and I thought the scene where the guy looks into the reactor, that was pretty good when his skin went immediately red. I was like, yep, I could see that happening when you look into an exposed nuclear reactor. Yeah.
But I'm not too sure about the other
fan, so I know that's not good for radiation either.
Yeah.
All right. Well, unfortunately, we've run out of time. So I'd like to give a warm thanks to our guests, Gillian, Andrew and Tina, for helping us understand the effects of radiation. And thank you to each of you in the audience for joining us today. I hope you learnt as much as we did. Unfortunately, we didn't get to everyone's questions. So if you did have a burning question you want answered, please feel free to email us at winaustralia@gmail.com and we will forward it on to the right expert to get a decent answer for you. When you close this webinar today, you'll be prompted to fill in a survey. It's not for Win Australia. The survey is for the researchers from the Science Communication, Outreach, Participation and Education Group at the University of Sydney, who are conducting a study into the experiences of online science communication as part of this year's online portions of National Science Week. So thank you all for joining us today. We hopefully will see you tomorrow for episode 2 in our webinar series, which will be on nuclear energy by our Win Australia President, Dr. Joe Lackenby. So hopefully see you tomorrow. Thanks, everyone.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank
it was really
you.
good.